To expand the conversation, we're joined by SABC Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease for more on the G7 summit. Sherwin, a very good evening to you. As we looked at some of the interaction between the Canadian Prime Minister and President Cyril Ramaphosa, it looks like President Ramaphosa received a much friendlier welcome than he got from President Donald Trump last month. I mean, what came out of these talks?
Well, remember that Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the G7, had a similar experience to President Ramaphosa in his capacity as both the South African President and, of course, the G20 President. They both had meetings in the Oval Office, and they both, managed to navigate those meetings with deft political acumen, if one wants to quote some of the analysis post that discussion. And so you saw what a bilateral meeting between two heads of state or heads of government is supposed to look like. Cordial in front of the cameras, and then you get into the intractable issues behind closed doors. What you saw at the White House was, a public display of ventilating issues of concern that really should have been discussed behind closed doors. And so you saw warmth there between the presidents of the G20, the president of the G7, and a mutual respect there. Does Canada and South Africa agree on everything? Certainly not, right? One of the sticking points between South Africa and a number of the Western nations gathered in Canada will be how to end the escalation you're seeing in the Middle East between Iran and Israel. South Africa has questioned Israel's assertion of its right to self-defense, the anticipatory nature of the invocation of Article 51 in terms of the UN Charter, which affords countries the right to self-defense. South Africa raising questions about whether there was an imminent threat here from Iran. Of course, this all stems from the IAEA report that said Iran had enriched uranium up to a point where it could fuel some 10 nuclear bombs, but the timeline for that remains unclear, given that Israel immediately the day after that report struck at Iran's military and nuclear sites. So yes, a very warm welcome there from the Canadian Prime Minister, a warm welcome that he extended to President Trump, who was also there. I can tell you the Secretary General of the United Nations is also en route there. But there are many intractable issues to be discussed at that meeting. There are questions around economic growth and the stability of the global economy based on the unilateral actions of the United States. There are concerns around energy security, and that'll be one of the topics that President Ramaphosa will take part in tomorrow in terms of the outreach element of the Leaders' Summit in Canada. And then, of course, the geopolitical concerns, right? When you talk about the economy in Paul, one has to arrest some of the military divisions you are seeing playing itself out around the world, because then those economic benefits cannot then filter down to places that are, at war with each other. And a great deal of concern, not only in the Middle East, but also in wars in Africa, Sudan in the main, Eastern DRC, which we know very well, and of course that long-standing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky also expected in Canada over the next 2 days.
Now, what's to be made of reports of US President Donald Trump's intentions to not sign the G7 statement related to Israel and Iran?
Well, the G7 presidency has already indicated that there will not be a joint communique, which is the custom at the end of these multilateral engagements, be that the G20, be that meetings at the United Nations in New York, or the G7, right? And so they are saying, we don't expect there to be agreement on everything. And that's kind of how these joint communications come to pass. So there is already an indication that there won't be consensus on everything, particularly as it relates to Ukraine, particularly as it relates to the Israeli-Iranian conflict. President Trump, we understand reports coming out of the G7 meeting today, refusing to sign on to a joint statement that would call for de-escalation between Iran and Israel. Yes, it's a statement that also asserts Israel's right to self-defense here, but the president reluctant to sign on to that joint communique that would call for de-escalation. And what message does that send? He believes that Israel is winning the war against Iran. What we do understand now is that Israel has air dominance over Tehran and Iran writ large. It is striking sites at will. And of course, Iran responding with ballistic missiles. But what we do know to be true is that Israel's intelligence here has been quite superior to that of the Iranian government.
Yeah.
And of course, you've also heard statements from the likes of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who told ABC News that he would not rule out taking out the supreme leader of Iran, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, among the strikes that have decapitated a number of senior leaders within the Iranian government, within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the armed forces. So superior intelligence, Israel has dominance over the skies. This is a very tenuous moment for the Iranian government, and I think President Trump, by not signing on to that agreement, probably knows a little bit more than we do in that regard.
Sherwin, the G7's been described as a small elite club. Why is it so significant to think about who will be in the room as important decisions are made, more so as you reflect the time of global turmoil and this new radical approach by the US to world affairs?
It used to be this elite club of the richest, most progressive and developed democracies in the world. You'll recall that between 2014, Russia was a part of what was then the G8. You now have the EU as a sort of regular member, so it is kind of still a G8, but it's you have the G7 plus the EU now. And of course, you heard in that meeting between President Trump and Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, President Trump expressing some regret that Russia was excluded from the G8 at the time, that then became the G7, after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And so, to your question, though, this sort of wealthy elite club, there's a recognition within the G7 that they have been seen this way around the world. And what you've seen over the last decade, certainly over the last decade, is invites extended to other leaders around the world that are not party to the G7. So you've had President Ramaphosa, for example, invited in various capacities. In this instance, as the G20 president, India's Prime Minister will be there at this meeting, the Australian Prime Minister. We understand the Indonesian government head of state has been invited, and various other leaders, including President Lula of Brazil, we understand, has also been invited. And so there is a recognition that the G7 needs to engage with other leaders around the world. And I think that's an argument that really buttresses the reason President Ramaphosa is in Canada at this time, because everyone now looks to the G20 as perhaps a little bit more representative of what the world, a multipolar world, looks like, as opposed to this Western elite club that in itself is finding out various limitations, right? The lack of consensus being one of them, given that the United States has taken a very strident posture in terms of how it asserts itself around the world. There is a different posture as it relates to the Middle East. There is a different posture as it relates to the war in Ukraine. And there's certainly a different posture as it relates to economic relations, even with former U.S. close allies. The EU, Canada, Mexico, and the like, all within the Trump vortex. And so there's a broader recognition here that expanding these conversations to include others outside of the G7 becomes important in terms of the veracity and the impact that the decisions and the communiques that they do manage to agree on around that table today. It becomes more viable if you have more people in the room supporting those initiatives.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that update. Wrapping up that with SABC correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease on the G7 summit.